So y'all have made it this far in the anxiety module, and y'all have probably watched a bunch of videos by now. And so we've talked a lot about a lot of different stuff, right? This is where anxiety comes from. This is how anxiety manifests. This is your brain gut for anxiety. This is the diagnosis of anxiety. And this is usually the point where people who come into my office and I'm explaining all this theory about anxiety, I'm like, oh, anxiety like comes from your mind, your deep-rooted insecurities, man. And they're like, okay, that's really great, that's really great. And I keep on explaining theory, right? I'm like, oh, and this is how anxiety is like, it's in the future. And like what you need, like you need to come to the present. And then people are like, oh, great, great, great. And at some point they're like, Dr. K, like, how do I do that? Like, what do I do about it, right? And at some point we have to talk about solutions. Like, what are you actually gonna do about your anxiety? So that's what we're gonna dig into right now. And we're gonna approach this a couple of ways, right? So we're gonna start by kind of explaining a little bit about what anxiety is, just give us a quick refresher. And then we're gonna talk a little bit about what our mind automatically does. And then I'm gonna give you guys 4 solutions to anxiety, maybe 5 now that I think about it. And 3 of these are gonna be things that we've sort of touched on in some way. And 2 of them are gonna be relatively new and sort of also like really, really difficult, but really, really important. Because the biggest changes, the most permanent changes that I've seen in people with anxiety are the ones that can really conquer the last 2. So let's start with our recap. So the first thing is, what is anxiety, right? So number 1 is anxiety is the future-focused mind. All of us have brains that are able to predict things in the future. And these are absolutely evolutionarily evolved circuits that are intended to kind of look into the future, predict danger so that we can make changes in the present and avoid that danger. So that's what anxiety is, the future-focused mind. The second thing is that when we think about anxiety, it's that future-focused mind that's kind of gone haywire and is really not functioning the way that it's supposed to. So why does that happen? And that relates to our samskars, or our micro-traumas, or things that have happened to us. Our insecurities, which tend to have to do with things that have happened to us in the past, are kind of the particular things that we get anxious about. Remember that not everyone is anxious about the same thing. So why is one person anxious about their appearance while another person is anxious about their competence? And so our individual securities are rooted in experiences in the past. So that's kind of a quick overview of what anxiety is. Next, let's remind ourselves, what does the mind or brain do when we're faced with anxiety? And there are 4 basic things that the mind does. And I want you guys to just stop for a second before we kind of dive into those. And remember that your body and mind do the best that they can, right? So if I like actually break my arm is gonna be like, oh my God, we're broken, like let's heal. And it does the best that it can to reform. The problem is that if I don't use something like a splint, even though the body is gonna heal, it's gonna heal and my arm is gonna be bent and crooked and I'll be like a little bit disabled going forward. And so in that same way, our mind naturally does a lot of things to deal with our anxiety, but the natural things that it does are not really optimized in some way, or leave us a little bit bent and a little bit crooked. So let's look at the 4 solutions that our mind naturally jumps to. So the first is distraction, right? When my mind gets caught up in the future and I'm worried about tomorrow, all I have to do is turn on the TV or open up social media or turn on a video game, and then boom, my mind is right back to the present. As I get lost in forms of entertainment, that anxiety kind of fades to the background. But what's the problem with that is that 4 hours go by, I'm gaming, it's a lot of fun, and as soon as the game ends, those problems still exist. And so distraction can be very useful from sort of a temporary sense, but they don't actually do anything to definitively deal with those problems in the future. The second thing that we do for anxiety is we actually try to avoid it, right? So our mind will tell us, oh my God, if I go to the party, then people will think I'm stupid. So I can avoid that bad outcome by not going to the party at all. And that's sort of fine. I mean, we can definitely not be anxious and not feel stupid, but we're kind of restricting our life by doing that. And people who let their anxiety control them tend to be very, very restricted, right? Like we don't want our anxiety to determine what we do. So we pay for our mental relief with our freedom. The third thing that we do is seek reassurance, because remember that anxiety is about my own insecurity. So when I'm feeling insecure, what do? I go to someone else and try to get them to reassure me, right? And if you have friends who are anxious, or maybe when you've been anxious, you'll notice or remember that you will go to someone else and basically ask them to kind of reassure you and tell you that your own thoughts are incorrect. And reassurance too can be really, really helpful. And there's some evidence that people who get continuously reassured, like especially around things like fear of abandonment, for example. So if you have a really bad fear of abandonment and you're in a relationship for a couple of years that's really healthy, there's some evidence that that anxiety will actually get a little bit better. The problem, though, is that for the majority of people, reassurance becomes something that you become dependent on. You're not really dealing with the root of the anxiety. The anxiety is kind of living in your subconscious mind and tossing thoughts into your head. And every time that thought gets tossed into your head, you want to go to a friend and you get them to kind of reassure you. But that anxiety-generating thought machine is still living in your subconscious, and you can become dependent on other people for reassurance. The last thing that we tend to do, and this is actually the most common experience in anxiety, is we fight it, right? Like, I've got these emotions and I know that my friends like me and they're inviting me to the party and my mind is just being dumb. I have no logical reason to feel anxious. I know that when I go to the gym, no one's actually paying attention to me. So there's that anxiety within you, right? That's like, oh no, don't go to the gym. Everyone's gonna think you're overweight. And then we do crazy things like we tell ourselves, I'm gonna get in shape first before I go to the gym. And so that's what our mind is telling us, and we realize how absolutely irrational that is. And so we try to fight our anxiety, right? We try to argue with it, we try to kind of bully it into submission. And that can work some of the time, right? Sometimes when we go to war with our anxiety, sometimes we're the winner and sometimes we're the loser. The problem still remains, though, that even if we win against our anxiety, it doesn't really stop it from coming back the next day. And in the worst case scenario, our anxiety is like a punching bag, where the harder we fight it, the harder it hits back. Because at the end of the day, who are we actually fighting? We're actually fighting our own mind. And so I don't know, I don't know how else to say this, but when you fight against yourself, for every win that you have, you're also gonna have a loss. And so fighting our anxiety just doesn't work. So now we're gonna get to, okay, fine. So these are the reflexive things that our mind does. So what are other ways that we can deal with anxiety? What are more productive ways that we can deal with anxiety? And so the first thing that we've already kind of touched on is we can bring our mind to the present, because anxiety literally cannot exist, cognitively anyway, in the present. So we can train ourselves with particular meditation techniques to focus on the present, bring ourselves back to the present. Those kinds of meditation techniques are also going to bolster our physiology, kind of balance our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and do a lot of stuff in our brain as well. So bringing back the mind back to the present is the first thing we can do against anxiety. The second thing that we can do is actually increase awareness of the anxious thought processes and the responses we have to them. So I know it sounds kind of weird because everyone's asking, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? But there's overwhelming scientific evidence that cultivating the capacity for awareness actually dissolves things. And there's an ancient yogic principle that awareness precedes control. In fact, all you need to do is become aware and then you will control something. And that idea may sound absolutely insane, but I want you guys to think if you've ever been to the dentist and you've ever gotten something numb. When you lose awareness of something, what happens to your control of it, right? When I become numb in my mouth and numb in my tongue, can I control it anymore? Absolutely not. And when does my control come back? When the lidocaine or the anesthetic wears off and I can start feeling it again, I can become aware of it. So there's good evidence that if you actually pay attention to your anxiety, and I know it sounds kind of weird, but what that means is almost like talking to yourself and noticing it and saying to yourself, oh, look, like my mind is being super anxious. Here we go again, I'm really worried about going to the party. And now, oh, look, there's that other response that I'm worried about going to the party. And then there's another part of my mind that's incredibly frustrated that I'm so worried about going to the party in the first place. And the more that you kind of take a step back and just observe that entire drama going on in your head, the weaker your anxiety will become. And there's good neuroscience evidence that cultivating this capacity of awareness strengthens our prefrontal cortex and our frontal lobes. And if you guys have watched that section on neuroscience of anxiety, you remember that the stronger our frontal lobes are, the more they control the other pro-anxiety parts of our brain. And that essentially our brain, when we kind of think about a moment of controlling anxiety, it's a war between our frontal lobes and other parts of our brain like our amygdala. So simply becoming aware of our anxiety and watching it may feel really dissatisfying in the moment, but that is literally the process that you have to do to rewire your brain. So becoming aware of our anxiety is kind of the first option in our toolkit to deal with anxiety. The second thing that we can explore is actually getting to the root of our insecurity. And this is where there are videos about some scars and dealing with some scars, and that's kind of covered a little bit elsewhere. But essentially remember that each of our anxieties is kind of rooted in a particular insecurity. So there's a stepwise process to understand where that insecurity comes from and to start the process of kind of metabolizing that pent-up emotional energy that creates the anxiety in your mind. So that's option number 2. And now we're going to get to the really, really fun stuff, my favorite stuff, but also the hardest stuff and almost the most spiritual responses we can have to anxiety. And so this comes down to 2 things. One is that anxiety is rooted in our ego or self. And the second is that anxiety is all about control. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is ego dissolution. So I know this sounds kind of weird, but when I think about anxiety, I'm always worried about a consequence to myself. And if you think about your anxiety, the problem, the danger that the anxiety is exploring is actually a consequence to you, right? So if you think about like looking stupid at a party, why does that matter to you? It's because people won't like you after that. Or if you want to, raise your hand in class and you know the answer, but you're afraid that you'll look stupid and then everyone will think you'll look stupid if you don't get the answer right. And so if we really pay attention very subtly, what your anxiety is trying to prevent always has to do with you. And so there's something that's really, really powerful from sort of like this Eastern tradition of yoga and meditation, which is that if you can kind of stop caring about yourself, you actually become completely liberated from anxiety. And what I mean by that is like, I want you guys to imagine for a moment that I actually didn't care what people thought about me. It wasn't important to me to have this identity that I put forward to the external world, where I know what I am, but I don't need the rest of the world to think I'm smart or think I'm stupid. I actually don't care about how the world perceives me. And so if that was the case, that would be incredibly liberating, right? If I don't care that people think I'm overweight when I go to the gym, I can just go to the gym because it doesn't really matter what they think. If I don't care about looking stupid, then I can raise my hand in class and I can offer the answer that I have. And if it's wrong and the professor corrects me, that's actually a win for me because then I know that I had some kind of incorrect knowledge that I can then fix when I actually take the test. If I can kind of remove myself from the equation of my anxiety, then I can take any action that anxiety restricts me from taking. Because remember that anxiety is all about you, right? You don't want to look this way. You don't want people to feel this way. You're afraid of this bad thing happening to you. If you go to your boss and you ask them for a raise, they're going to think you're greedy. Once again, there's always that word, you. In all of your anxiety, there's this idea, me. And if we really stop and think about it, that's actually what holds us back. The more our mind thinks about, oh no, what about me? Oh no, what about me? Oh no, what about me? The less we can actually take action in life, right? And when I let go of myself and when I say to myself, I actually don't care what people think. I'm going to go to the gym because that's what I need to do to be healthy. I'm not concerned about my ego or my identity or the perception that others have for me. And so we can engage in techniques of ego dissolution, where the opinions of other people, or even my opinion of myself, in the most drastic and advanced cases, doesn't really matter. Where I move from being a person to just kind of existing and living life instead of like being concerned about like who I am. And I just start to take action in the present. And when you let go of your ego, what's going to happen is you'll start to become liberated from anxiety. And the last way that we're going to talk about dealing with anxiety is also a really potent method, but can take a lot of time to develop, and is also really terrifying to people, and that's to surrender. So if we think about anxiety, remember, anxiety is all about control, right? So your mind generates particular problems in the future, and it tells you how to avoid them. And if I can control the future, then I don't have to be worried anymore. As we face uncertainty, anxiety tries to tell us to shape that future, to turn that uncertainty into certainty. I can take the uncertainty of looking dumb if I go to a party, and I can remove it entirely if I don't go to the party, right? I can avoid that uncertainty entirely. So if we really think about it, anxiety is our war to control things. And so in a bizarre way, if we can learn to surrender, anxiety actually goes away completely. Now, this is terrifying for people because for people with anxiety, this feels like they're giving in to their anxiety. And it can feel like they're letting their anxiety win. But the truth is that it's actually subtle, but it's the exact opposite. What you're telling your anxiety is, your anxiety has these fears, right? That if you do this, this will happen. And if you learn how to surrender, what you're telling your anxiety is, so be it. Whatever fear that your anxiety has, and it says, oh my God, if you don't study tonight, you'll fail. Even though you've studied all week, you'll still fail. And then you tell your mind, so be it. You surrender. You learn how to say, you know what, I've studied every day, and this is as much as I'm going to study, and if I fail, so be it. And when it comes to going to the gym, we can use that example again. So when I go to the gym, my mind is telling me, oh, people are gonna think you're overweight and out of shape. And then you tell your mind, so be it. You surrender to that. If that's what people are gonna think, let them think it. And so it's really, really terrifying because if you tell, this is the exact thing that the anxiety is telling them not to do. And what we want to do is actually let go completely and let our anxiety, if our anxiety is telling us, okay, this bad thing is going to happen, just let it happen and surrender to it. And this concept is actually really important. And there's a really good Sanskrit phrase that kind of embodies this concept, which is the phrase karma phal. So karma is the Sanskrit word which means action, and phal is the Sanskrit word for fruit. And so what this phrase means is the fruits of your actions. And half of our suffering in life, or even 90% of our suffering in life, or 99% of our suffering in life, comes from a human being's desire to control the outcomes of their actions. But what karma phal teaches us is, as a human being, you actually don't control any of the outcomes of your actions. You only control the actions themselves. And if you think about what anxiety is trying to do, anxiety is actually trying to control the outcome, right? You're trying to think about what kind of clothing that you wear to control the thoughts of other people about you. You're trying to think about going to the gym and how you need to be in shape to control other people's responses to you. So anxiety is all about controlling things in the outside world, which is absolutely idiotic because you can't actually control a single thought in a single person's head. And yet you spend all of your time, your mind is working so hard to give you that guarantee that you won't look stupid, that people won't make fun of you. And that's something that you can never get. So what does karma phal actually tell us? What karma phal tells us is that what you should do is devote yourself to the action itself, not the outcome, and surrender the outcome to the universe, to karma, to God, to entropy, whatever you want to. But as a human being, I can't actually control what happens. I know it sounds really, really crazy, but even if we think about taking a test, I can't actually pass or fail a test. I know it sounds absolutely crazy, but I want you all to really think about this. I cannot pass or fail a test. All I can do is study, and then I can show up, and I can answer every question. But I do not control whether I fail or I pass. And once you understand that, then you'll understand how to let go and how to surrender and devote yourself to the action. Because when we really look at anxiety and how it cripples us in our lives, what anxiety does is keep us from acting. That's the whole friggin' problem, right? Is it paralyzes us and we can't do what we want to do because our anxiety is always thinking about, oh no, this is gonna go wrong. This is gonna go wrong. You better not do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. And so what we do when we try to control our lives is we actually become really restricted and we lose our freedom. So if you learn to surrender, paradoxically, By letting go control of your life is how you actually gain power over your life. And that is all accomplished through surrender.
Okay. Is something wrong with the prompter?
No, the prompter's fine. I'm just, hold on. It just feels weird reading the script.
Anything in particular?
Just this section here is just like, feels weird to say. Okay, I think,
Need a pen?
yeah,
It's purple.
that's fine. So I think what I'm gonna do is just,
Cut the cameras.